Hello and welcome to another episode of the Breaking Muscle podcast. I'm your host, Tom McCormick, and today I'm going to be flying solo again as I walk you through an episode on diet periodization. Now, I've recorded a couple of episodes lately outlining exactly how to structure your training and your diet for muscle gain. And towards the end of the diet episode, I touched upon the concept of diet periodization. Diet periodization is an extremely effective strategy that allows you to get the most out of your training. Following the old school perma-bulk strategy doesn't end well, usually ends up with people just gaining a ton of fat and not that much muscle, and neither does trying to stay shredded year round, especially if muscle gain is your goal. So, while periodization in training is widely accepted for elite level athletes, and many recreational lifters understand its value too, there's very little awareness of diet periodization and its impact upon your results and how it can improve them. Sadly, you can't just follow the same workout routine and diet plan and get great results indefinitely. The training you do becomes less effective due to the law of diminishing returns, sometimes referred to as adaptive resistance, which is something I covered in my training episode and explaining why your training needs to change over time to keep you progressing. Well, your diet is, or at least it should be, closely linked to the training that you do. So as your training program changes, the diet protocols you do or you use should change somewhat too. Now, the key principles of good nutrition still apply, but how you fine-tune those to get the most out of every phase of training does change. So, much like you should be changing your training in a logical manner to keep making progress even, you should also change your diet to keep making the best possible progress. And if you don't do so, I think it's a crucial error, especially if you're a relatively advanced lifter. Like if you're a beginner, this is probably too advanced for you to be worrying about. But if you're someone who's been training a good number of years, made quite a lot of progress and has started to see a slowing down in that rate of progress, this is one of the tools that could help you to unlock the next level of progress for you. Your training creates the potential for muscle gain or fat loss, but your diet will dictate if you reach that potential. I just want you to let that sink in for a moment, because I think all too often us training geeks get so focused on how we can fine-tune and optimize our training that we miss the wood for the trees a little bit. And if we want physique changes, our diet is absolutely essential to achieving that. All the training in the world isn't going to get you jacked if you don't eat enough to grow. And training your ass off, but eating a calorie surplus and junk food diet is going to result in you not getting as lean as you want if you're cutting too. So your diet really is crucial to get right to maximize your results, especially if changes in your physique are what you're looking for. So your training and your diet should reflect your goals, and your workouts and your nutrition choices should work synergistically to help you reach those goals. That seems pretty obvious now, I've just said it, but many people fail to do it. For example, you see probably people like this all the time, or doing variations of this, but I certainly see people trying to out-train a bad diet when their goal is fat loss. Or when they're wanting to build muscle, they train really, really heavy. They basically test their 1 rep max. They don't do much volume. They're avoiding carbs, or some variation of that. Things that don't really stack on top of each other to move towards the big goal. So in both cases that I just outlined there, the person who's doing that will get suboptimal results. It's plain as and simple as that. They'll waste a lot of time and energy for a really poor return on their investment of time and energy. Like, if you're in the gym working hard and investing a lot of time and energy in it, you want to see some return, and your diet is going to go a really long way to determining how much of a return you see on the training efforts you make. So, with just a little bit of planning, you can avoid that common mistake of failing to sync your diet and your training up. Diet periodization is simply making planned changes to your eating habits to match the training stimulus you are creating in your workouts at that moment in time, and to move you towards your immediate goals as efficiently as possible. So utilizing diet periodization makes the progression towards both your short-term and your long-term physique goals much, much more efficient. Syncing your diet and training together isn't complicated. By assessing your goals and what they require from a training stimulus standpoint, and therefore also a recovery and nutrition standpoint, you can set up a successful diet and know how to adjust it as you progress through different phases of training. So just a final point I want to make on this, the importance of syncing this up, is your training is like a car with the engine running and the foot on the gas pedal, and your nutrition is like the steering wheel. So it can either steer you towards fat loss by structuring your diet that way, or it can steer you towards muscle gain and weight gain. And the training stimulus you create will vary, but it's not necessarily dramatically different. But if you're eating in a deficit, not consuming any carbs, and you're training to build muscle, then you're going to have a really hard time doing it, and vice versa if you make the same mistake. So save yourself a lot of time and frustration. I'm speaking from experience here. For so long, I was training really well in a muscle building style, but I'd got lean on a low carb diet and thought I would try and get massive on a low carb diet, and it just didn't work for me. I needed the extra calories and the extra carbohydrates to fuel the training and recover optimally from it. So I've made this mistake of training in theory well, but just not supporting that training with the proper nutrition to go alongside it. So it really stalled my progress dead in its tracks. And once I'd realised the error of my ways and fixed it, I suddenly saw great progress. And I think if you're making these mistakes, you will see a massive return on investment from just thinking these things through. Now, when it comes to body composition goals, there are 3 traditional phases of training. Number 1 is mass gain or bulking, often known as bulking, or I prefer to call it building. Another is fat loss or cutting. And then the third is maintenance, or sometimes, like I prefer to call it solidification, or you can call it strength focus block. The terminology that you use for those 3 phases isn't that important. But the point is, there's a phase where you're focusing on weight gain and muscle gain, a phase when you are actively trying to lose weight and body fat, and a phase where you are maintaining your body weight steady. Now, if you're not sure why you want to do a maintenance phase, what the sensible point behind that is, I will cover that later on, and also I go in really big detail on the value of one of those phases in my training podcast, Mapping Out Muscle Gain. Anyway, so we've got that mass gain or that building phase. Now, just quickly on that, I prefer to call it building because I think bulking has negative connotations. People think it's just about eating a bunch of junk, stuffing calories in like a YOLO seafood diet, eat everything in sight. And often that's where the issue of, like I alluded to, with the permabulk kicks in and they just gain a lot of body fat. Whereas building, I think, has much more positive connotations. You think of the foundations you're putting in place, stacking things brick by brick, one step at a time, and it's a gradual building process. And I think that really helps just to think of it that way. And it's a small, subtle change, may seem like semantics, but when I talk to people and clients and they start to get in the mindset of building, they have a really positive outset about the journey that they're on, but also they tend to avoid gaining excess fat. And just for that reason, it's a real win for me. So, if you have listened to my training podcast, like I said, it's called Mapping Out Muscle Gain. You'll know that I break this building phase into sub-components or sub-phases. Now, the principles of the diet that best supports these sub-phases are the same, but there are some small yet important details to optimize each phase. So I'll cover that in a minute. Now, just to reiterate, each of these phases should be matched up with the right eating plan to maximize your results. You won't be eating the same way, we shouldn't be eating the same way throughout all 3 phases. You need to build a diet plan that works synergistically with each phase, and that will put you in a position to accelerate your progress. So, to determine the dietary approach which is best for each phase, it's pretty simple. Ask yourself 3 questions. The first question is, what is my main goal for this phase of training? Second question, what type of training is best to achieve this goal? Third question, what type of nutrition plan supports this type of training? It literally is as simple as that. If you can ask yourself those 3 questions and clearly answer them, it should help everything to crystallize. Once you answer those questions, genuinely, a framework will crystallize of dieting that is essentially it's obvious. It's blindingly obvious once you see it, and then from there it's just a case of fine-tuning the details to best suit you. So let's go over each phase. So like kicking off with a building phase or a mass gain phase or a bulking phase, if you call it that. Well, what's the goal? increased muscle size, obviously, and that will come along with some weight gain on the scales. So what training best achieves that? Well, relatively high volume weight training, mostly in the 6 to 12 rep range, but with some work, higher rep ranges in sort of 15, 20, maybe even up to 30 reps, or using strategically, as I do in the PBS system that I mentioned in my mapping out muscle gain, some metabolic stress type work, some higher rep work. But the vast majority of your training will be 6 to 12, maybe 6 to 15 reps. So what nutrition best supports high volume training in that rep range? Well, first of all, a calorie surplus. One of the most powerful tools for recovery is eating a surplus. Your performance week to week, when you're in a healthy, robust surplus, is usually fantastic. It's amazing how you can keep adding weight to the bar, finding extra reps here and there on sets when you are in a significant surplus. Next, the most important thing is to have an adequate protein intake to maximize muscle protein synthesis, because after all, what we want is increased muscle size, and essentially that is when muscle protein synthesis, or the building of new muscle proteins, exceeds muscle protein breakdown. So it's vital we have enough protein coming in to support that. Next up is sufficient fat intake to optimize hormonal levels. Finally, the final key point here is high carbohydrates to support that high volume training. High intensity exercise such as lifting weights, bodybuilding style training in those rep ranges is predominantly fueled by glycogen, muscle glycogen, and that comes from consuming carbohydrates and you storing it in the muscle. So it makes sense to have a high carbohydrate diet. So your total calories, to achieve that surplus, you need to eat a surplus of calories to gain muscle once you're past the beginner stages. You may have heard that you can build muscle in a deficit or even at maintenance. Yeah, it's true, but it's really tiny amounts, nothing that's going to transform your physique and you're going to be able to see. It's probably something you can see using some really advanced technology, some scanning equipment, something like that, but no one's going to look at you and notice you gained half a pound of muscle whilst in a deficit and losing some fat necessarily. Whereas if you are in a robust surplus and you pack on a good 10, 15 pounds over several months, that will start to show up pretty obviously. And over the long term, as you cycle through these different phases of training, through building phases, through solidification phases, through cutting phases, that will make a dramatic difference to your physique. And just on the point there, you will need to cycle through these because, as I said, your body has adaptive resistance. It will stop adapting to the same stimulus if you keep exposing it to that. Your training will need to change, and eventually there's only so much muscle you can build in a given time period, and it will get harder and harder. That law of diminishing returns kicks in, and you're better off backing away, changing the training stimulus, holding on to what you've got, and then stripping away some fat, and then going again. Again, more detail was covered on that. Really, really in-depth discussion on why that's needed in the mapping out muscle gain. So let's move on to covering how much of a surplus and how you can establish that. You need to eat enough to gain between 1/4 and 0.5% of your body weight per week is a really good rule of thumb, and that will equate to most people having about 150 to 500 calories a day over their maintenance needs. Now, for most of you, that will cover it. But you want to take an outcome-based approach to this. Weigh yourself several times each week, and if you can do that, do it first thing in the morning before breakfast, but after taking a pee, so you can get consistent readings, and see if you are within that 0.25 to 0.5% per week rate of gain. If you're gaining 1/4 to 0.5% of your body weight each week, you can be confident you are gaining muscle mass, but you are keeping fat gain in check to some extent. When you're in surplus, you will always gain a little bit of body fat. That's okay. You can diet that away very quickly. Building muscle is a much slower process than fat loss is. So the good news is keep fat gain in check, but maximize muscle gain. And then when you transition and cut, you can trim away all that fat very, very quickly and reveal the physique you've built. If you're not sure where to start out to establish your surplus, my Diet for Muscle podcast that was released last month covers that in great detail. But a quick and easy rule of thumb that you can use to kick-start things if you want to get going quickly is simply to multiply your body weight in pounds by 16 and eat that number of calories per day. But just remember, that is only a rough guide. It's just a starting point, and you want that outcome-based decision-making. Am I gaining weight at the rate of 1/4 to 0.5% of body weight per week? If not, adjust your calories. So just use that rate of gain as a feedback tool to assess and reassess your calorie needs. You might need to eat 17 or maybe even 18, 19, 20 times your body weight in pounds for you to gain at the appropriate rate, because it's dependent on so many factors. Your activity levels, one person's activity levels to another are vastly different. So the number of calories they expend just going about their routine on a daily basis can be very different. But if you begin at 16 and you're not gaining weight, bump it to 17 times your body weight, reassess and progress. Keep adjusting until you're gaining weight at the desired rate. The body is an infinitely complex system with countless feedback loops. Your needs will continue to fluctuate based on numerous factors, and it's important to reiterate that progressive overload applies in the kitchen and not just the gym. So if most of us are familiar with, we need to try and lift a bit more weight, do a few more reps to progress in the gym and give the body a stimulus to grow. Well, you need to apply the same thing in the kitchen. As you gain body weight and muscle mass, the chances are you will need to eat more calories just to sustain that, let alone gain more. So there's not going to be a one hit, this is how many calories I need to build muscle. This is how many calories I need to build muscle at this moment in time with my current training program and activity levels. And when I've gained another 15 pounds of muscle and I'm handling higher overall training volumes, I may well need more calories to keep growing. So as you progress through your mass phase, your calorie needs will probably need to be adjusted. Simply take that outcome-based approach I mentioned earlier. Continue to monitor scale weight and adjust based on that. Don't do arbitrary changes and think, I'm just going to bump it up every 200 calories every 2 weeks or something. You've got a great feedback tool. The scale is a very powerful, very accurate tool for this. Just remember, if you're not gaining quickly enough, increase your calorie intake. Anywhere between 150 and 250 calorie increases, and then reassess works really well. Often use that with clients. Takes a little bit of trial and error to find the sweet spot, and then for the next couple of weeks weight goes perfectly, then it plateaus perhaps, and we need to adjust again. Just bear in mind, it is not a one hit, this is the diet for you. You need to constantly be reassessing and adjusting. Now, when you're making those increment changes, probably best to take the lower end for smaller guys if you're naturally, say you're quite short and slim naturally, or if you're very close to your genetic potential, actually, it probably no need for you to go into an outrageous surplus, just have enough of a surplus, which will be quite small at that point. The gains is marginal gains when you're close to your genetic potential. Sadly, the gains slow down at that stage. But take the higher end of the range, so maybe you're increasing calories by 250 calories to see if that kickstarts growth. If you're a bigger person, taller, maybe slightly larger frame, or if you're relatively new to training, because your potential to build muscle is higher if you're newbie, and you can get away with eating that slightly larger surplus, and your body's just in a position to build more muscle because you are way away from your genetic potential. Now, we've covered total calories and how you should be reassessing that, how you set them, how you adjust them. Let's move on to refining your macronutrient needs for a building phase. So just to reiterate or to cover this again, if you don't know, macronutrients are stuff your body needs in large quantities. They're measured in grams, and they are protein, carbohydrates, and fats. So protein, I mentioned it already, the importance of muscle protein synthesis, or MPS, but it's arguably the most important physiological factor when it comes to building muscle. Eating protein stimulates MPS, and muscle growth can only occur if MPS exceeds muscle protein breakdown. So, key thing, get a calorie surplus and then make sure you are eating enough protein. It's imperative you eat enough protein to max out your MPS across the course of a day. Now, interestingly, research indicates there's an amount of protein which achieves this, and eating more doesn't have any additional benefit, at least for muscle gain. So it's not like, 200 grams of protein is good, 400 grams is better. There is a point where eating more protein doesn't seem to have any additive effect. So, to help you establish that, to build muscle, anything in the range of 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilo of lean mass is sufficient. Now, just so you know, a gram per pound of body weight is 2.2 grams per kilo. But since most of us don't have access to really high-tech things like a DEXA machine to measure our lean mass that original data was set on, I just keep things pretty simple, and I say shoot for 2 grams per kilo of body weight, or for those of you working in pounds, that's about a gram per pound of body weight. In fact, if you're eating a gram per pound, you'll be having slightly higher. As I said, that'd be 2.2 grams. The key thing, though, is it's a very simple number for people to remember. And the most important thing with working with clients is that they adhere to the plan. So rather than complicating this too much and using sort of decimal points, I give round figures for that protein, and we can be confident you're getting enough. So to reiterate, a gram per pound of body weight, or 2.2 grams per kilo of body weight. Now, split that intake into 4 to 6 meals each day based on your preference or your schedule, and you'll be absolutely fine when it comes to your protein intake. Splitting it up, rather than just having 2 massive meals of protein, splitting it up is superior. Again, marginal gains, but every little counts. And if we're doing diet periodization, then you should be able to get 4, maybe 5, or even 6 if you prefer eating that way. For most of the people I work with, 4 to 5 meals per day is the sweet spot. That brings us on to fat next. So eating dietary fat is important for your regular hormonal function, especially testosterone production. And obviously we know that testosterone is a vital hormone when it comes to building muscle. Now, fat should never be eliminated from the diet. But there's not so much as an optimal intake, but a minimal for normal hormonal function. And science tells us that fat intake should be between 20 to 30% of total calories to optimize testosterone production. Now, with that said, once you get above about 0.35 grams per pound, which is roughly 0.8 per kilo, the threshold has been crossed of having enough fat to optimize hormonal function, and there are no significant benefit to hormones when you go above that in a calorie surplus. It might be a little bit different if you're in a deficit and you want slightly higher just to safeguard hormonal function, but when you're in a surplus, the chance of hormonal disruption is pretty low, and especially if you're hitting that threshold. So just to reiterate, 0.35 grams per pound is a pretty good place for your fat intake. Now, above that point, like I say, there's no real benefit for hormonal function or structural and chemical processes. It just becomes a fuel source at that point, a bit like how we think of carbs. It's not such an efficient fuel source. So generally, like I say, when in a building phase, I don't suggest you necessarily go beyond about 0.35 grams per pound or 0.8 per kilo. And I tend to have an upper threshold of 1 gram per kilo. Again, because it's easy to remember, and sometimes people just find eating slightly higher fat, like around about that gram per kilo or 0.45 grams per pound, helps them to adhere to their diet and have some variety. And that is, as I said, adherence is key. So that's important. If that means that they can consistently stay in a surplus and stick to their diet, that's fine. But just so they're clear, I let them know it's not because it's supercharging their hormones. Right. Final of the macros that we're going to discuss, carbohydrates. So once you've got protein and fats set, then carbs make up the rest of your total daily calories. It's as simple as that. Carbs, like fats, have a positive impact on hormones. They're also the dominant source of energy for the central nervous system, and as I mentioned earlier, high intensity activity, like lifting weights. They help you to fuel grueling, effective training and aid your recovery from that training. And approximately 80% of your weight training is fueled by glycogen, which is stored carbohydrate. So being low carb and therefore low glycogen will impair your training and your recovery. So eating sufficient carbs allows you to train at a higher intensity with higher volumes and recover quicker, which is a pretty good combo, right? But just to add on top of that, carbs also have anti-catabolic and anabolic effects. So not only do they avoid the breakdown, they support the building of new tissue. And they are basically a huge advantage to hard training individuals, especially those aiming to build muscle. Your carbohydrate needs are going to vary. Much like your calorie needs will vary based on activity levels, your carbohydrate levels will vary and largely based on activity levels. So given you should be training with high volumes during a building phase, your carbs will need to be pretty high. A fairly recent scientific review recommended carb intakes of between 4 and 7 grams per kilo for strength athletes. Now, most recreational hard training guys will fall at the lower end of that range in my experience. 4 to 5 grams per kilo is ample. That's about 2.25 grams of carbs per pound of body weight. So, a 170 pound guy in a building phase would need roughly 308 to 385 grams of carbohydrate per day. Now, within a building phase, I suggest you focus on mechanical tension and increasing training volume gradually when you're setting up your training program. And the final phase, however, within a building phase is a metabolic stress phase. This is like the throw the kitchen sink at it phase. It offers a novel stimulus when adaptive resistance is starting to kick in. So you've done a bunch of traditional bodybuilding style training, you've used progressive overload, you've focused on placing tension across the muscle and working in the 6 to 12 rep range predominantly, and that starts to become less effective. What can we do? Well, we can use metabolic stress, which is one of the other pathways for muscle building, and that can get you a little bit more growth before you have to kind of knock the building phase on the head. Metabolic stress focused training emphasizes cell swelling and the pump as a pathway to more muscle growth. You will do lots of volume, quite high reps, shorter rest periods, and your training density, so the work per unit of time, is pretty high. And to fuel this, you definitely need carbs, lots of them. You want to have muscle glycogen levels topped up going into training sessions and to replenish them quickly after training. So as such, the diet plan for the metabolic stress phase shifts slightly from the rest of the building phase by emphasizing carbs even more. Often I have guys going up to as high as 7 grams per kilo, which is a shade over 3 grams per pound of body weight in a metabolic stress phase. And that's useful because you're going to deplete glycogen quite a lot with the high workout volume and density, and you want to recover and replenish that quickly, and you want to have it topped up for your next session, but also working in the kind of time under tension and the energy systems you're going to be stressing in a metabolic stress phase. You're going to be doing sets or supersets or giant sets or drop sets. Quite often you're going to have muscles under tension for north of 60 seconds, 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes, sometimes even more. And that energy system is quite carb intensive, quite carb dominant, and you need the fuel, otherwise your performance will tank. And if your performance in the gym is not good, then you're not going to be providing the stimulus you need to get the most on the phase. Now, it's a relatively short-term strategy, the metabolic stress phase, in my experience. Between 2 and 4 weeks is the best time frame to use it, to really take advantage of it as a training style and maximize your muscle building progress from it before you transition to a lower volume solidification phase. So consequently, the nutrition for the solidification phase should be different to the metabolic stress phase to reflect this, because it's lower volume training. It's that the training style has changed and the stimulus we are providing is different. I'll cover that in a minute. But just to recap, here is how to track your progress during a building phase. Aim to gain 1/4 to 0.5% of your body weight per week. So in real world math, that is a 170 pound guy should be trying to gain roughly 1 or 2 pounds every 2 weeks. But don't let decimal points and percentages make you crazy. Just use it as a rough guide and make sure the trend line is heading in the right way. Lots of things can throw the scale weight off just on a day-to-day basis. So keep it all as a general guideline, but the trend is what you're looking for. You might get on the scales and there's about a dozen reasons why your weight can fluctuate. Don't panic if one day it's down a bit or it's jumped up a bit. If we're gradually going across on a rolling average of 1/4 to 0.5% of your body weight per week, you're doing great. When progress stalls, increase your calories. Somewhere between 150 to 250 calories per day is a good place to be. If you are a real beginner or you really haven't seen any weight gain, then you might want to be even higher than that, maybe even jumping it up 500 calories. Just to reiterate, pick the lower end of that range if you are lighter and or a fatter individual and you're close to your genetic potential, and the higher end of the range if you're naturally bigger or very, very lean or a beginner. Adjust based on scale weight with the predominance of additional calories coming from carbs. So don't just make random increase in calories because you feel like it. Check your progress. Are you gaining at the appropriate rate? If you are, brilliant, nothing needs to change. If you're not, then make the change and bias carbohydrates, because once the protein and fats are in place, more doesn't have any additional benefit. The carbohydrates will just help to fuel and your workouts and help you recover that little better. One thing from a training perspective is keep an eye on your strength in the 6 to 12 rep range and also your volume. So not just like your 6, 10 and 12 rep maxes, but also what's your performance across, say, 3 to 4 sets. Is that improving as well? And then that would indicate that your overall training volume is improving. And if it is, then that's a fantastic indicator that you are also gaining strength, but also size. And lastly, when you go into the metabolic stress phase, where if you're following the PBS model that I outlined in my Mapping Out Muscle Gain podcast, that's when you really push the carbs in. You will benefit from that, and the quality of the training in that phase will improve because of it. Right, that's the building phase done. Let's cover fat loss or a cutting phase. So you ask yourself the same 3 key questions as we did when you're outlining the diet for a building phase. What's the goal? A reduction in body fat, obviously. What's the best training to achieve this? Well, it's as high a volume as you can recover from, and that will be less than it is in a building phase because you have a calorie deficit. Being in a calorie deficit means your ability to recover from training isn't as good as during a bulk or a building phase, but you should strive to do as much as possible to provide the strongest signal to the body to retain muscle and also create quite a high energy expenditure, which will help with fat loss. So higher training volumes also help create that calorie deficit that I just mentioned. You might also include some form of cardio to speed that or aid that calorie deficit you're trying to create. So you're looking to try and train pretty similar to when you're building muscle, but you have less energy coming in, so you might find your ability to tolerate that high training volume does drop off a little bit. What's the best nutrition to support this goal? Well, you want to lose fat. You need a calorie deficit. Just like a calorie surplus is required to optimize muscle building, a calorie deficit to lose fat at a significant rate is required. Protein, next most important, you need enough to maintain muscle mass. We still want to be initiating and maxing out muscle protein synthesis. Now, your protein intake actually in a cut might want to be slightly higher than it is in a mass or building phase, or even in a maintenance phase. And that's because we want to preserve muscle mass, and eating sufficient protein. Well, after hard training, the next most powerful stimulus you have to retain muscle mass is eating sufficient protein to maximize muscle protein synthesis. Increasing your fat intake compared to a building phase is also a good idea, not outrageously, but the risk of hormonal disruption is higher when you're in a calorie deficit. So bumping those fats up slightly could be helpful. That means obviously we potentially are looking at having slightly higher protein and slightly higher fat, and you're in a deficit, so your carbs will be noticeably lower in a fat loss phase than they are in a building phase. But they should still be high enough to support training with high volumes. Keep them basically as high as possible while still losing fat. Given a deficit is required, carbs will be lower than they are in a building phase, but they don't need to be in the basement. You should still be able to have sufficient carbohydrates in there, to feel fairly human, but also to perform well. Right, let's get some details on the bones of that skeleton. So protein. Protein preserves lean tissue when dieting and has the highest effects on satiety, and that's the sense of being full. So it's for those two, those are 2 really good reasons to consume slightly more protein during a diet. And research suggests anything between 2 and 3.1 grams per kilo, which is 4.4 to 6.8 per pound. Hang on, that's not right. It's not 4.4 to 6.8 per pound. That would be a monstrous amount. I've done the maths the wrong way. It would be half that. So it would be just about a gram to 1.4 grams per pound. Sorry, my maths went very badly wrong there. But those quantities are effective during cutting phases. And most people will do best with 2.2 to 2.5 grams per kilo, which is 1 to 1.2 grams per pound. Now, base the exact amount on your eating preferences. The key to, like I said already, the key to a successful diet is your ability to adhere to the plan. Now, the overarching theme here is we need a deficit and we need sufficient protein to maximize muscle protein synthesis. If you find eating the higher end of that range helps you to achieve that, go for it. If you find that having just enough protein to give you space for higher fat and carbohydrate consumption makes sticking to the diet easier, go with that. That is definitely something that you can fine tune to you. There's not a perfect diet for everyone. The whole point is especially of this is finding ways to optimize it to you and your situation. Fat intake. So as I've mentioned, the hormonal disruption is the risk of that is higher when you're in a cut, especially if you are following a prolonged low-calorie diet phase. To mitigate this, increase your fat intake compared to your building phase, but it isn't an excuse to go full Atkins and start chowing down on avocados wrapped in bacon, dipped in butter, inside a pizza. Just be mindful that you need to be in a calorie deficit whilst consuming sufficient fat, not to feel like a bag of crap the whole time, honestly. So as a rule of thumb, eat about 1 gram kilo of fat per day, which is a little bit under half a gram per pound. It's about 0.45 grams per pound. Carbs. Whatever calories you have left over will be spent on carbs. Fight to maintain more than 2 grams per kilo, which is about a gram per pound, for as long as possible to allow for productive training. I have found when people have managed to stay above that threshold, it really makes a positive difference to the quality of their training. Now, if you listen to my previous nutrition podcast, I'll walk you through exactly how to determine calorie intake from protein, carbs and fats. But the key is to remember that protein and carbs contain 4 calories per gram and fat is 9 calories per gram. So once you've set your protein and fat intake in grams, you can multiply them by 4 and 9 respectively, and then subtract this, add that number together then. So you've multiplied your protein intake in grams by 4 and then your fat intake in grams by 9, and that will give you the calorie for both. Put those two numbers together and then subtract it from your daily target. Or your daily calorie total, and then you have the amount of carbs intake in calories. And then to convert the calorie content down to grams, simply divide that number by 4, and that will tell you how many grams of carbohydrate to have per day. Right, just to recap on a cutting phase, let's look at how you can track your progress during a cutting phase. So with this one, like I said earlier, you can lose fat quicker than you can build muscle. So the rate of loss on the scale is a little bit quicker. We're aiming to lose between 0.5% and 1% of your body weight per week. So if you weigh 215 pounds, that means you need to lose roughly 1 to 2 pounds a week. Consider the difference between a mini cut and a full-blown get shredded diet when you're planning this out, by the way. So a mini cut is simply a diet that gets you lean enough to start building again. It's not a get shredded diet, and it is only 2 to 6 weeks in length. With that, you can be a bit more aggressive because it's relatively short period of time, and you're not getting exotically lean, you're not getting in bodybuilding stage ready condition, you're just getting nice and lean to put yourself in a position to gain again. So the risk of muscle mass is lower because 2 factors: the diet's not that long and you're not getting really, really lean. If you're doing a full-blown get shredded bodybuilding diet, prep diet, that's different. It's going to take longer and you have to get such a low level of body fat, the risk of muscle loss increases, and so I would slow your rate of gain in that situation. So with a mini cut, actually, week 1, I quite often see people lose 2% of their body weight, and then that drops off to 1% for the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, however long that mini cut is, up until a threshold of 6 weeks maximum. With a sort of contest prep style diet, it's going to take at least 12 weeks, and honestly, it's going to probably take a lot longer than that, usually closer to 20. And sometimes, quite often a little bit longer if they want to get really, really lean. If you want striated glutes, for example, on that basis, we would be putting in some diet breaks, but also dieting at a slower rate. So you'd be more like 0.5% of your body weight for most of it, and maybe even slow that rate down to 0.25% when you get really, really close to the end, because we don't want to give up any muscle tissue. Now, when progress stalls when dieting, you need to lower your calories or increase your activity level. Generally, I like to do a little bit of both, but I try to get the smallest change to get the outcome we need to get you back at the rate of gain we're looking for. That often results in people having to lower their calories by about 200 to 250, but anything between 250 and 500 per day is a reasonable adjustment to make. Again, take the lower end if you are smaller and or already lean or leaner, and B, you can be at the higher end if you're a really big guy or you have higher body fat. Much like the building phase, use the scale to your advantage, use that as a good feedback tool, but also you can use progress pictures, and if you have any sort of access to body composition measures like a skin fold, they can all help to guide your adjustments. Now, we move on to a solidification or a maintenance or even a strength phase. But let's, with those names out of the way, maintenance doesn't sound that great, does it? Let's address the issue of training for maintenance, why you should do that. So muscle building or hypertrophy training requires you to train hard and with high volumes while progressively overloading your body. More is better, but you can't indefinitely train harder and for longer. Eventually, the law of diminishing returns will kick in. The more you do something, the less you get from it in subsequent exposures. To overcome this, you need to periodize your training. I sort of covered this a little bit earlier on, and you will at times need to train with lower volumes. And just to reiterate, actually, or just to recap, more is better as long as the quality is high. Like just doing crap training and loads of it isn't going to get anything. We're assuming the quality is good here, but If you can do more training without exceeding your capacity to recover of high quality training, you will see improved results. So, for example, periods of time spent training for strength or while eating at maintenance should be included to allow for full recovery and to set the scene for the next block of hard muscle building training. By reducing your training volume short term to maintenance levels for maybe a month or so, you can resensitize your body to the training volume or high training volumes again, and then ramp back up in your next building phase to take advantage of that. If you just try and do the same training all year round, you will stop seeing progress. You need to fluctuate and vary the training variables to keep progressing. And one of the ways to do that, as hard as it seems for some people, is to back off, lower the overall training, stop being a stimulus junkie and chasing the pump. Just do some good quality, lower volume strength training, allow your body to recover, become more receptive and responsive to traditional bodybuilding training that you were doing, and then go back to it, and you'll see much, much better results when you return to it that way than if you keep just sort of bashing your head against the brick wall. These maintenance phases allow your body to settle, refuel, and prime yourself to continue your muscle building journey. After long mass gain phases, you accumulate quite a lot of fatigue, your body becomes less insulin sensitive as you've gained body fat, and it adapts, as I said, to the high volumes of training, and it requires you to do even more to overload the system, but there's only so much training you can do. And then you keep shoveling food in, you try and do more training to provide a stimulus, and all that really happens is it sets you up for higher chance of fat gain, overtraining, and or injury. And then one of the best ways to trash your physique progress is to be injured and unable to train. So we want to avoid that. So taking properly timed deloads can help to mitigate these risks for periods of time, but they can't compensate for months and months of hard training. A maintenance phase is just what the doctor ordered in that instance. Another instance for a maintenance phase is to help you to retain the muscle you built during a bulk or a building phase. It gives your body a chance to become adapted to its new, more muscular set point. This is crucial if you are a hard gainer. Vital step is to not go a building phase and immediately cut aggressively. You will give up a lot of the muscle you built in your building phase very quickly. Use the maintenance phase at the end of your mass phase when calories and training volumes are at their peak. During this phase, you'll attempt to maintain your body weight, own the new muscle that you've built, sort of adapt to a higher settling point, let the body adjust to its new normal body weight, and as a result, it will hold on to the muscle you built much better when you do go into a cut. But calling it a maintenance phase, no one wants that, right? No one's interested in that. We all want to make progress and sort of think about we're training hard 24/7, 365, right? So that's why I tend to call maintenance phases solidification phases, because essentially you are solidifying or perhaps consolidating your gains and safeguarding yourself against muscle loss when cutting. The exact terminology isn't really important, but the key is to realize this phase serves a valuable purpose and that you buy into it. Whatever name works for you is the key. Something that you can get behind and get motivated. So some of my clients prefer to think of it as a transition phase between bulking and cutting, or a strength phase. I like focusing on the strength gains actually quite a lot, because with this phase they can be quite impressive and powerful motivators for people. We all like to see progress, of course, and if scale weight is no longer a metric that we're using because we're actually specifically trying to keep our body weight the same, the whole point is to keep it static during this phase. Having some other objective measures to focus on is useful. And if you utilize the strategies in the podcasts that I've done recently properly, you will gain strength in this phase. The solidification phase is a strength phase. So why not call it that? Especially if that works and helps you be focused and motivated. Now, again, while this all might seem like details that just don't matter in semantics, the vocabulary used can make a big psychological difference and improve adherence. So pick whichever language suits you and then get your head down and do what's required. And in this case, that is a low volume strength training block while eating to maintain your body weight. So maintenance phase training and nutrition guidelines. So train for strength, so you're going to be using lower frequency, lower volume, lower reps, but you're going to be probably heavier weights than you're used to in your mass gain or building phase, or even a cutting phase, and especially more heavier weights than you were using in that metabolic stress phase to wrap up the building phase. So for example, 3 sets of 5 is a rep scheme that I really like during this period of time. It works because it's much easier to maintain muscle mass than it is to build it. So the stimulus from training can be much lower in terms of volume, but we've been handling bodybuilding rep ranges and that metabolic stress phase. We get a novel stimulus by handling some really heavy loads. That will help to retain the muscle, give it a novel stimulus, but also, as I said, let the fatigue wash away. And as you do that, the first week of a maintenance phase, your strength may not be incredible, but week 2, 3, 4, as fatigue continues to drop, you will find performance increases. There's a phrase in sports science called fatigue masks fitness, and you'll be really able to display your strength levels towards the end of this maintenance phase, which again is quite rewarding, especially when you're like, I've just kept my body weight the same, and most people like to see some changes on the scales, but really seeing your strength come through and really kick in can work well there. Now, as for nutrition, as I said, the point is to maintain your weight. So that is like an isocaloric diet, which just means maintain your body weight. So while eating at maintenance and training heavy, there's basically very little risk of any muscle loss. So protein can stay the same as it does during a building phase. We don't need to, like in a cut, bump protein higher. Carbs can be reduced because training volume, or certainly reduced compared to a building phase, because training volume is significantly lower. And actually your training volume will be lower than it was in a cut too. But calories are higher because you're maintaining, not losing weight. And then fats, I find this can be quite useful, can be increased somewhat to offset the reduction in carbs and ensure hormonal levels are good, but also give you that opportunity to have a different type of diet, have some more variety. If you have a slightly higher fat diet, and give some foods in that maybe you're not able to have as much of as you would ordinarily like, or in other phases, especially in a cutting phase. And so this phase allows you to recover some insulin sensitivity after all the high carb eating you've done in the building phase. It also allows some psychological relief after following a high carb, sort of relatively low fat diet that I outlined for your building phase. You might be sick of foods like rice, oats, potatoes, and pairing them with relatively lean protein sources. As a result, this really is an opportunity to have some fatty foods with some carbs during the maintenance phase and help wash away any fatigue, sort of dietary, psychological fatigue that might be there, and set you up for the next phase of dieting. Now, since maintaining your weight is the goal, all you have to do is get on the scales and keep it there, but you can be quite flexible within macronutrient ratios in this phase. So you need to eat as many calories as it takes to hold your weight steady. And then protein, I would usually go with about 2 grams per kilo, 0.9 to 1 gram per pound. Carbs tend to be somewhere between 2.5 to 3 grams per kilo, but basically about half of the peak you had in your mass gain phase. So if you were someone who ended up being at 7 grams per kilo in that building phase, in the metabolic stress phase, you might find that you're still at 3.5 grams per kilo in this. And then fat is the rest. Whatever's left over, you can use the kind of same methodology as I outlined in that cutting phase in terms of work out your total calories, work out how much you're going to consume from protein and carbs. Whatever's left over is fat. And as a rule of thumb, that quite often ends up with 1.25 to 1.5 grams per kilo, which is quite a high fat intake. And like I say, for just a couple of weeks, gives you different foods to choices that you can potentially make, and also we can build in sort of metabolic flexibility. So your ability to tolerate and use carbs for fuel is important, but also the ability to be flexible and shift over and use fat for fuels is a great thing to have from both a physique standpoint, but also a long-term health standpoint. And this can help with that a little bit too. Remember, when if you're tracking progress, the goal is just to maintain your weight. Get stronger in the gym, hold your weight steady. That's what we want. Now, your weight will fluctuate. That, as I mentioned earlier, that's perfectly normal. But if it does it by more than about a pound, so roughly half a kilo, then you might need to adjust your calories. But don't go too crazy if it bounces up. One thing to know is if you're doing a maintenance phase or a solidification phase off the back of really high carb metabolic stress phase, as those carbs come down, as you adjust your diet, you will lose some weight, almost overnight quite quickly. It is just water weight. So it takes about 3 grams of water to store every gram of carbohydrate as glycogen. And so if you suddenly drop 200 grams of carbs out of your diet, there will be a shift in weight on the scales. that's fine. Let the first couple of days happen and kind of settle, but then after that, it should hold steady. If it continues to drop, then you're actually in a deficit, and we don't want that. We want to hold your weight steady. All right, putting this all together. So I've outlined the basic different structures of training. There's the building phase, the solidification phase, the cutting phase, and then the dietary protocols that go alongside that, and how you should periodize your diet to match the training periodization you follow. Now, here's how this might look. So a good structure. So assuming you're relatively lean, or roughly 10% body fat now, for example, a building phase lasting 14 to 20 weeks until you reach, say, 15 to 18% body fat, or to be honest, this is again a bit of an individual preference thing. If you start to feel a bit uncomfortable about the level of body fat you have and you're carrying, that maybe is when you want to cap your building phase. Then take a solidification phase for 4 weeks, consolidate the gains you've made, gain some strength, get rid of some fatigue, set you up for a cutting phase effectively, because you have motivation and energy to train, but also the risk of muscle loss is diminished because you've taken this solidification phase. Transition to a cut, generally a mini cut, so 3 to 6 weeks, probably until you get down to around about 10%, and then you can repeat the process. Or if you want to get shredded, like I was saying, if you're thinking of competing in a bodybuilding show or something, then take an extended cut. 3 to 8 weeks is unlikely to get it there for you. You will take a bit longer, and as I said earlier, your rate of loss should be a little bit lower. But long story short, that cyclical pattern is extremely effective. You manage training stimulus and give new novel stimulus to keep you progressing. When you hit adaptive resistance, you pivot, you change, you back away. But by supporting that with changes in the diet, by periodizing your diet, you get the most from your training, and you get far superior results compared to if you were just winging your diet and kind of training really hard and sort of fingers crossed the diet goes accompany that and does well. So there you go. I really think if you stand back and reassess things, your decision-making process can be relatively straightforward. I really hope that info has helped you to get some clarity about how you approach both your diet and training going forward, and also highlighted that there are logical steps to go through with the decision-making process. If you do this, I'm confident you will see excellent results if you can put this into practice and stay consistent with it. It's one of those ones I think people get themselves confused with what training they should be doing and then what diet they're doing, and often they're not synergistic and they're not working together. By taking these principles, you can really mesh them together and make it a 1 + 1 = 3 kind of relationship, where great training with great nutrition that's really tailored to the training stimulus gets you outstanding results. If you like the principles behind this, but you're still a little uncertain about how to apply them, then please feel free to get in touch with me at tom@breakingmuscle.com, or DM me on Instagram at Tom McCormick with any questions you have. Obviously, I coach people too. If you're interested in having me coach you through the process, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. But if you have any questions about setting this just up yourself, also more than happy to answer those. So ping those across to me. And that is it for diet periodization. I really hope that's been helpful. I look forward to speaking to you again soon. I've got some more great guests lined up. So excited to do those interviews. And that is it from me.